Do you have questions about COVID, about the flu, about shingles, RSV, vaccinations? Then you do not want to miss AARP Real Possibilities. Stay tuned. Thank you for watching today, AARP Real Possibilities. I am so excited to have the one and only renowned Dr. Bagdasarian with us today. She is the Chief Medical Executive for the state of Michigan. That is a hefty title, Chief Medical Executive for the entire state. You bad woman. And bad means good in this context. Tell us a little bit about you and how you got that position.
Well, I am an internal medicine physician by training. I did my medical school training in Detroit, so really have done all of my training here in Michigan. I went to the University of Michigan for internal medicine and infectious disease training after that. Many, many years of going to school to study what I love, and that has really been infectious diseases, keeping people healthy, preparing for emergencies, and communicating to the public. Those are all the things that I feel very passionate about, and those experiences really led me to this position.
Well, we are fortunate, the state of Michigan is fortunate to have you. I know you led us through the COVID virus that we had here, the pandemic that we had. You were on the task force, you were there every week, you were leading the entire state, getting information from all over the world, really, in terms of COVID and how to protect the people in Michigan. So from that point, you know, we're back, we're all in person again, pretty much, whatever the new normal is, and yet we're in a flu season. Not just COVID, but flu season, vaccine season. Talk a little bit about what people need to know as they enter into these winter months.
Well, I'm really glad that you're talking about this and that we're having this conversation today, because I really want people to know what we're heading into and to be prepared, because we're in a very different place than we were in back in 2020 or even 2021. We're in a place now where we've got tools, and we've got the tools to be able to keep ourselves safe and healthy. And so I really want to make sure that Michiganders know what those tools are, know how to access them, so that they can make sure that they stay safe during the winter cold and flu months. We are heading towards an uptick in all of the viruses that like to circulate during the winter time. And it's not just COVID-19, but the other viruses that like to circulate during this time are other coronaviruses. We've got RSV, the respiratory syncytial virus, of course, COVID-19. And we've got, as I mentioned, tools. And one of the biggest tools that we have are vaccines. So I first want to make sure that people know about these vaccinations.
And we want to talk about the vaccinations, but there's also an uptick a little bit now in terms of COVID or COVID variant. And we're not certain whether or not, a lot of people ask me whether or not the vaccines, older adults particularly, whether or not the vaccines that they've already had will protect them against this new variant. What would you say to them?
So number one, yes, we are seeing a slight uptick in COVID-19. We started from a historic low. So we were in a really good place with COVID, and those numbers have started to go up a little bit. Now, what we are expecting, what we're forecasting is for those numbers to continue going up, because we know that COVID loves to spread when, number one, kids are back in school, when people are gathering indoors, when people are gathering in poorly ventilated spaces. So COVID likes to spread during the fall and winter months. And in terms of things that you can do to keep yourself safe, we do have new vaccines that were just announced a few weeks ago, and those will become available this fall season. And so it's really important for folks across the state to make sure that they're vaccinated with the most up-to-date formulation of those vaccines. And we do have data to show that those vaccines are both effective, that they're safe, and that they cover the circulating variants.
And that's always a concern in terms of the safety of any vaccine that people are putting inside of them. So when you talk about there's data that shows that, talk a little bit about that data.
Absolutely. So we know that vaccines overall go through a very rigorous process in order to be approved. And no corners have been cut with evaluating the safety of the COVID-19 vaccines. So the vaccines have gone through all of the steps that they've needed to go through. And in fact, the COVID vaccines are some of the most widely studied vaccines that we've ever had. not only that, but they have been used in millions of people now through the pandemic. So we have lots of real world experience with them. And we know that if there are any adverse effects, sometimes people can feel sore and achy after receiving the vaccine. There are some complications that can happen. People can have allergic reactions. But we know that any benefits far, far outweigh the risks of the vaccines.
And so people need to absolutely encourage everyone to get their vaccine. Will this be something they'll have to do every single year, get a vaccine for COVID and for its variants?
Most likely this will become an annual thing. So we know that the vaccines are incredibly effective, not effective in preventing mild illness, but effective in preventing those serious complications, in preventing hospitalization. They protect you from ending up in the ICU, from ending up on a ventilator, which are all the things we want to avoid. So we know that they are incredibly effective, but that immunity can wane over time. And so the best immunity is for maybe the first 3, 4, 5 months after you get immunized, and then some of that immunity starts to wane. And so having this done on an annual basis, it really does two things. Number one, we can make sure we're keeping up with the circulating variants. And number two, we can make sure that people have the best immunity as they head into the winter months, which we tend to see viral infections peaking usually between November and January, sometimes a little bit sooner, sometimes a little bit later.
And we talk a lot about COVID for obvious reasons, but there's also the flu, and then there's also shingles, and there's pneumonia and other vaccines. Should people get all of those, or is there just one vaccine that's a superpower that will take care of all of those different ailments?
I wish there was one vaccine that worked against them all, but the fact is that they're all a little bit different, and so they all have different needs. We can talk about influenza next. Influenza is also a virus that really can change from year to year. And the benefit of getting a yearly or an annual flu shot is that we, every year, the CDC and the FDA, they look at formulations that target the variants that have been circulating around the world. So they look at what variants have been circulating in the southern hemisphere, in places like Australia and South Africa, and then they can target the vaccine towards those. So getting a flu vaccine every year is really making sure that you're getting the most up-to-date vaccine to tell your immune system exactly what to be on the lookout for. And then, of course, making sure that you've got the peak levels of immunity through those winter months.
And what about shingles and pneumonia?
So shingles and pneumonia are also a little bit different. Shingles is a virus that is, it's the same virus that causes chickenpox. And it is a virus that can live inside your body. So if you have had chickenpox in the past, it's a virus that can actually live in a nerve root and then erupt when you are stressed or when your immune system is a little bit down. So the shingles vaccine is really reminding your body to be on the lookout for something it has seen before. So it's essentially giving your immune system a little bit of a preview of something to be on the lookout for. The pneumonia vaccine is another different kind of vaccine. So again, teaching your body which specific proteins to be on the lookout for. And the pneumonia vaccine doesn't protect against all types of pneumonia. It protects against a few very specific serotypes of pneumonia. So all of these vaccines work in different ways, but they're all really doing the same thing. They're working to keep your immune system functioning in peak performance and really looking out for the right types of viruses and antigens out there.
You made an excellent point too in terms of just people making certain that they get the virus, they continue with the updates and makes every year that they get whatever the new variant, a virus against, a vaccine against the new variant. But where can you get these vaccines? Do you have to make a doctor's appointment? Can you go to your local Walgreens, CVS? Where can people get them? How can you get access to them?
So there are a few different places where you can go. The good news is that most of these vaccines are covered by standard insurance coverage, and so if you have, insurance coverage in the state of Michigan, most of those will cover these types of routine vaccinations. So the best thing to do is to see your healthcare provider and say, which vaccines am I eligible for? Some of these recommendations will differ depending on your age group, your types of risk factors. A healthcare provider can advise you which vaccines are right for you. Many doctors' offices offer those vaccines right there in-house. Some doctors' offices will ask you to go to a pharmacy, and there are pharmacies across the state that offer these vaccines. Some of these vaccines are also offered at local health departments, but the way that I would start would be to talk to your healthcare provider to see what you're eligible for.
And the point that you made earlier about very few people have died from the vaccine than have died from the various viruses that are out there.
Far fewer.
And so people who are afraid, you should be more afraid of the virus, particularly if you have any kind of compromising health issues going on.
Absolutely.
Than of the vaccine.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
And in fact, when we look at vaccine outcomes, when we look at vaccine safety, we're looking at a whole spectrum of things. We're looking at any sort of complaints that people have afterwards, whether they're complaining of feeling sore and achy or a little bit of fever. We're looking at all of those types of complaints. And when you look across the board at those types of symptoms, again, the types of symptoms people experience from the vaccines, they are far less severe than what we are seeing with complications of illness. So really, when these vaccines are evaluated, we're doing a risk-benefit analysis, and the risks of the vaccines are far lower than the benefits.
I want to compliment you and your entire team, Lieutenant Governor, on the work that you did with the COVID task force. It was absolutely phenomenal, and it made a difference, and I am absolutely convinced it saved lives. Will you have mobile units? Will there be mobile units going into neighborhoods again to provide vaccines for people who can't get out or who are at home and can't get out to get the vaccines that they need?
So this year is a little bit different when it comes to COVID vaccine, and it's because the public health emergency is now ended, and we are now integrating COVID vaccine in with other routine vaccines. And so COVID vaccine is being commercialized for the first time. So this is the first time that the COVID vaccine is not a federally allocated resource, and that pharmacies and doctors' offices are actually purchasing the vaccine. Now, there are still lots and lots of initiatives to get vaccines out to communities that are vulnerable, to folks who can't leave their homes. There are still lots of initiatives out there, but things are working a little bit differently this year than we've seen in the past because of that commercialization of the vaccine. Now, what does that mean to folks who are interested in getting the vaccine? I think the first thing that I would do, again, is go and see your healthcare provider and find out which vaccines you're eligible for right now and see if they're offered in your healthcare provider's office. The next place would be to look at your local pharmacies and see if they are offering the vaccines that you need at your local pharmacies. And then, of course, health departments can be a great resource for folks who are unsure about where to access some of these other vaccines. And I did want to, if it's okay, mention that there is one other new vaccine that's coming out this year that we haven't talked about yet, and that is a vaccine for RSV, for respiratory syncytial virus. And this is one of those viruses, when we talk about the triple-demic, when we talked about that triple-demic last year, the triple-demic was, we talked about it in terms of COVID-19, influenza, and RSV. And RSV is really a virus that can make people sick, give them a respiratory symptom, give them respiratory symptoms and sometimes respiratory distress, and can affect people at the extremes of age. So we worry about those who are very young, so the under 2 age group, especially children who are going through their first RSV season, so the under 1 age group. And then we also worry about people who are a little bit older and those who are over the age of 60, for example. And the new RSV vaccine will be available for folks who are over the age of 60, but we are asking them to have a conversation with their healthcare provider, again, to talk about risks and benefits and to see if they are eligible for this vaccine.
And so people pay attention. I mean, just don't take this information and not do anything with it. Call your physician, call your primary physician, find out exactly exactly what you should be taking and which vaccine and which one's good for you. And just go to the doctor now. Prevention makes much more sense than waiting till something happens and then trying to go and get it remedied later on. So let's be proactive with all of this. I want to go back to something that you said in terms of people getting vaccines. I read that in America, I think it was, only 20% of those who are eligible received the vaccine or the booster. Why is there such a hesitancy? And is it older adults, younger adults, middle-aged? Why? And what can we do?
Well, a couple of really interesting trends emerged during the COVID-19 pandemic. The first was when vaccines first became available, we saw a lot of people waiting in line and rushing out there to get those vaccines the moment they could. And there were a lot of people who were enthusiastic about vaccines, but we also saw a lot of people who were on the fence. And then a lot of people who said, absolutely not, these are not for me. And I think part of that was because COVID-19 was so politicized. And it really became a discussion that was more about politics and less about health. And we need to start reframing this and thinking again about our objectives, which it's to keep people safe and healthy, especially during times of crisis. And so during COVID-19, some of the discourse went a different direction. It became less about health and more about politics. And I'd like to start framing the conversation about health again. What we saw with COVID was we saw better uptake of vaccines in those very early days. Demand seemed to die down. And we were left with a trend that I thought was very interesting, where those over the age of 65 are highly vaccinated in our state and in our country. And then vaccination drops down across the age group. And in fact, our kids under the age of 5 have some of the lowest numbers in terms of COVID-19 vaccination. And we know that COVID can affect young children just as much as it can affect those in other age groups. We also saw some geographic trends. We saw that there were some counties that had very low vaccine uptake. And when the bivalent vaccine came out, there were fewer people getting the bivalent vaccine. Now, if you recall, this was the vaccine that was available last year. And the number that you mentioned, that 20%, and actually in our state it's about 18%, that's uptake of the bivalent vaccine. So it really tells us that most Michiganders, more than 80% of Michiganders, have not had a COVID vaccine in over a year. And what that means is there are more people who are vulnerable. There are more people who are vulnerable going into this cold and flu season as we see those COVID numbers start to tick up. And now another really surprising and interesting thing happened during COVID-19, and that is we started to see a decline in some of our routine vaccinations as well. And I'm not talking about COVID vaccine or even flu vaccine now, but we saw a decline in our routine childhood immunizations. And fewer children across our state are now vaccinated against things like measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox, and even polio.
That's where the fear came in.
That is where the fear and the politicization
of it.
came.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Now that, before there was all sorts of testing that was going on with COVID particularly. Now people are doing more at-home tests. How reliable are those at-home tests?
Now, the at-home tests are pretty good. And they're pretty good if you do a couple of things. Number one, if you repeat them. So if you take a test and it's negative, if you repeat that test in a day or in a couple of days, that is going to help boost the sensitivity of the test. And they're also good, I'll say they're also better at picking up whether someone has COVID once they become symptomatic. So some of the tests are not as accurate or as sensitive early on. So repeating the test is really key. But I do recommend that people still keep a supply of those at-home tests at home. If you're symptomatic, it's really good to test and then repeat that test in a day or so if it was negative. But the other point that I'd really like to make to your viewers today is that even if you test negative for COVID, it's important to stay at home if you have symptoms. Stay at home if you have any respiratory symptoms, if you are coughing and sneezing and you have a runny nose, because there are lots of other viruses that circulate during these fall and winter months. And we really don't want the spread of any of them, whether it's COVID or influenza or RSV or something else.
How long should they stay home when they see the symptoms, when the symptoms surface? How?
Well, it's important.
5 days?
It's important to take that COVID-19 test. And if your COVID test is positive, we'd prefer that you stay at home for 5 days and then continue to mask after that. If you are having symptoms and your COVID test is negative, we'd still prefer that you stay at home until you are feeling better. So that could mean until your fever is gone and has been gone for about 24 hours, until you start to feel that things are taking a turn for the better. But if you are still coughing and sneezing, it's a really good idea to wear a mask around others.
How long are you contagious from the time that you first get symptoms and from the time that you first test positive?
So it's different for each one of these viruses. And that's why I think it's important, number one, to take the COVID test, because we know that COVID can shed for 5 to 10 days and even a little bit longer. So take that COVID test. If your COVID test is positive, we would prefer that you stay home for 5 days and then mask for an additional 5 days. But at the very least, the advice is stay at home until you are feeling better, because each one of these viruses is a little bit different. However, there are a few common threads, and that is that when you are feeling very unwell, when you are sneezing and feeling rotten, those tend to be the times when the virus is really replicating and has the greatest chance of affecting other people. Once you've taken a turn for the better, with many of these viruses, that means that your immune system has now kicked in and you don't have as much virus replicating, and that means less virus shedding into the environment.
So rather be safe than sorry. We've got 30 seconds left. Mask or no mask?
So our message right now is mask if you feel that you need extra protection, if you're concerned. If you choose to mask, please continue to do so. I think masking is also really important if you are feeling unwell and you must be around other people. So if you have to go out into a space with other people and you're feeling unwell, it's a good idea to put on a mask to protect those around you.
Great information, a lot of news that hopefully you will use. Thank you so much, Dr. Bagdasarian, for being with us today. You have just done a phenomenal job and we appreciate you.
Thanks for having me on, Paula.
Thank you.
Hello, we're here to discuss the non-pharmacological approaches to pain management today. When it comes to managing pain, the first and foremost best thing you can do is having a good night's rest, adequate exercise. That's generally about 150 minutes per week. Generally, you want to aim for at least walking 30 minutes 5 times a week. Also, a well-balanced diet. When it comes for diets in general, a Mediterranean diet is excellent. There's high amounts of vegetables, fruit, nuts for protein, and trying to stay away from sugar-free and processed foods. Also, never underestimate the importance of smoking cessation and drinking alcohol in minimal to moderate amounts. Also, when it comes to pain overall, there's a certain few things that we should all consider. First and foremost, you have the biopsychosocial. That is a fancy way to say that we perceive pain biologically, is how we perceive it from the outside environment. Psychologically, which is how we mentally process that pain, but also socially. How did we learn to perceive pain from our family and our friends and what was acceptable? When it comes to pain management overall, there's a lot of things that we can do. Certainly having that rest helps, but there's also, you can use braces for certain joint pain. You can elevate the extremity if it's hurting. There's also hot and cold compression. Generally, you want to put a hot or cold pack on the skin with a protective barrier for 15-minute intervals. And then you can also use a lot of different topical medications. There are some that are ibuprofen based, there are some lidocaine based, even menthol based, and those really help trying to target pain in different areas. And there's also NSAIDs like Tylenol, ibuprofen. In general, you want to target pain for more than 1 or 2 different ways, because you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. Well, thank you very much for your time, and I hope you have a great day.
Transportation and things to consider. Thank you so much for being here. What are some considerations that people should ponder before deciding whether or not to tell a loved one to give up driving or not? It's a hard decision to make.
Very hard, absolutely. Well, as people age, they often experience diminishing vision and hearing, and also cognition and physical ability. And those are good prompts for whether or not you should give up driving and consider other modes of transportation.
It's hard to recognize those sometimes. I mean, so what are some of the signs that what do you actually see? Someone being impaired and not able to drive?
Sure. Not being able to see ahead and react appropriately to other stimulus that is outside of their control. That's one of the biggest triggers, I think, or marks of diminishing ability for driving.
And sometimes it's probably a good idea to have them look at other modes of transportation before they get to that point, so they're comfortable with those. Is that correct?
Sure, absolutely. Another impetus is also the fixed income that most seniors are on, where the ability to afford gas, insurance, and the general maintenance of a vehicle may be a little bit out of reach for them. So that's another sign.
And there are options. People need to apply for it. Those options are like Spectrum and some of those other options.
That's right. And that Spectrum application is reviewed by a third party. It is Disability Network Capital Area, and the application can be found at cata.org/Spectran.
Okay. Thank you so much for that. I appreciate you being here today.
Thank you.
Retirement. That word comes up a lot with me for some reason. I'm glad you're here, Chris. So you can talk about retirement and legacy planning. What do people need to know?
Yeah. Well, I think there's 5 key areas as it relates to planning for your retirement and a legacy. And we have a process, and we call it creating your retirement blueprint. And there's 5 key areas. So first is income planning, figuring out when to take Social Security. Should we take the pension? How are we going to recreate that income that we had while we're working? Second is investment planning, managing market risk, making sure that the way that we invest when we're 60 or 70 probably should be different than when we were 30, right? Third is tax planning, and I think taxes are one of the biggest risks and biggest opportunities with the changes in tax code. Fourth is healthcare and long-term care planning, especially long-term care costs can be devastating for a family.
Absolutely.
And then the 5th key area is that legacy planning. So what are you going to leave to the next generation? And I'm not just talking about assets or net worth, but how are you going to remember it? What, did you have a plan, or was it a mess that the kids had to clean up?
And how many times have we all seen that, where even celebrities don't have a will, don't have an estate? So what do people need to know? I mean, if you're thinking about retirement, if you're thinking about legacy, and you want to do that, what do they need? What's the first step they should take?
Well, the first step is they should find someone who's done it before. And that's really where we come into play as certified financial planners, certified elder law attorneys. We bring the legal, the financial, tax planning all into one solid plan for the benefit of our clients.
And so people need to make sure that a person is certified. How do they find someone?
Yeah.
How do they do? They go to Yellow Pages? They know Yellow Pages. Google. What do they do?
Right. So a lot of times referrals, but also certified financial planners and certified elder law attorneys, which are the gold standard as it relates to estate planning and financial planning. You can find them online, but a lot of times talking to friends or other coworkers is a great way.
Sounds good. Thanks for being here, and thanks for that good advice.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Real Possibilities today. Hopefully that you will share the information that Dr. Bagdasarian shared with us, and you'll share that with others so we can all stay safe. Thanks for watching Real Possibilities.